I never thought I would find myself standing in my driveway at 2 in the morning, watching a fire truck pull up to my neighbor's house while she screamed at me from her front lawn in her bathrobe. But that is exactly where life took me on a Tuesday night in Scottsdale, Arizona. It all started 3 weeks earlier when I moved into the Saguaro Heights subdivision, a gated community that promised peaceful desert, living with mountain views and friendly neighbors. I am Kendrick, a software engineer who had just landed a remote position with a tech company in California, and I figured Arizona would be the perfect place to settle down. The house was a beautiful southwestern-style ranch with terracotta tiles and a decent backyard that backed up to the community wash. I spent my first week unpacking boxes and setting up my home office, blissfully unaware of the hurricane that was about to enter my life. Her name was Patterson, and she was the vice president of the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association. I first met her on day 9 of living in my new house. I was outside watering my desert willow trees with my brand new garden hose, an expensive commercial-grade hose I had splurged on because the Arizona heat was no joke, and I wanted something that would not crack or split. It was bright green, 50 feet long, and had cost me nearly $80 at the hardware store. Linda came marching across the street like she owned the entire neighborhood, which in her mind, she probably did. She was about 50 years old, with that particular haircut that seemed to be standard issue for women who enjoy speaking to managers. You know the one. Short, heavily layered, blonde with dark roots showing through. She wore white capri pants despite the fact that it was only April, and a pink polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. "Excuse me," she said, not bothering with pleasantries like hello or welcome to the neighborhood. "I need to speak with you about several violations I have noticed since you moved in." I turned off the water and walked over, extending my hand. "Hi, I am Derek. You are?" She looked at my hand like I was offering her a dead fish. "Linda Patterson, HOA Vice President. Now, about these violations. First, your garbage cans are visible from the street. They need to be stored in your garage or behind a privacy screen. Second, you have not submitted a landscape modification request, yet I see you have been working in your yard." I looked at the single bag of mulch I had spread around the trees that came with the house. "I am just maintaining what was already here. Any landscape modifications require written approval from the Architectural Review Committee," she said, pulling out a small notebook from her pocket. "Third, your house numbers are the wrong font. They need to be replaced with approved bronze numbers available through our designated vendor. The house numbers that were here when I bought the place, previous owner got a pass because he was on the board. You are not." She made a note in her book. "Fourth, I noticed you have not attended any HOA meetings. Attendance is strongly encouraged." I tried to keep my voice level. "I have been here 9 days. The monthly meeting was 6 days ago. You should have introduced yourself." She clicked her pen and tucked it back into her pocket. "I am going to give you 1 week to address these violations before I start issuing fines. Fines start at $100 per violation per day." She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my garden hose in one hand and a growing sense of dread in my stomach. I went inside and pulled out the massive HOA handbook that had been in my closing documents. The thing was 247 pages long. I had skimmed it before buying, noting the usual stuff about no parking on streets, no loud parties, keep your lawn maintained. I had not realized I was moving into what essentially amounted to a dictatorship. Over the next week, I dealt with the violations. I bought a storage screen for my garbage cans. I submitted a landscape maintenance form for work I had already done. I ordered the overpriced house numbers from the HOA's vendor, which cost me $120 for something I could have gotten at Home Depot for $15. I was not happy about it, but I figured it was easier to comply than to fight. That is when things started getting weird. I came home from a grocery run on a Saturday afternoon to find Linda standing in my backyard. Not near my backyard, not at the fence line. In my actual backyard, walking around like she was conducting an inspection. "What are you doing?" I called out, setting my grocery bags on the patio table. "Monthly HOA inspection," she said, making notes on a tablet. All properties are subject to quarterly exterior inspections as outlined in Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws. You did not ask permission to come into my yard. Permission is not required for HOA inspections. She zoomed in on something with her tablet camera. "Your back fence has some weathering on the posts. You will need to repaint or restain within 30 days. I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. "The fence is 6 years old. Normal wear and tear is expected. All wooden structures must be maintained in like new condition," she said. Section 15.7. I will send you a formal notice. She walked past me, through my side gate, and back to the street without another word. I stood there feeling violated. I had lived in rental apartments before this, where the landlord had to give 24 hours notice before entering. Now I owned this place outright, and some HOA Karen could just waltz through whenever she wanted. I decided to do what any reasonable person would do. I went to the next HOA meeting to voice my concerns. The meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a nice building near the front gate with a pool and fitness center. About 30 people showed up, mostly retirees who apparently had nothing better to do on a Thursday evening. Linda was there, sitting at a table at the front of the room next to a thin man in his 60s who introduced himself as Robert Chen, the HOA president. I waded through 45 minutes of the most boring administrative discussion I had ever witnessed. They debated the color of flowers to plant at the entrance for 20 minutes. Someone complained about a dog barking 3 streets over. Another person wanted to propose a ban on inflatable holiday decorations. Finally, they opened the floor for new business. I stood up. "Hi, I am Kendrick on Sunset Mesa Drive. I wanted to ask about the inspection policies. I came home last weekend to find the vice president in my backyard without any notice or permission. I am not comfortable with people entering my property without consent." The room got quiet. Linda's face turned red. Robert cleared his throat. "The HOA bylaws clearly state that exterior inspections can be conducted with reasonable notice." "I did not receive any notice," I said. "Notice was sent via email 3 days prior," Linda interjected. "Not my fault if you do not check your email." I pulled out my phone and opened my email app right there, searching for anything from the HOA. "I have nothing from you." "Email was sent to the address on file," she said smugly. "After the meeting, I checked with the HOA management company." The email on file was the previous owner's email address, which nobody had bothered to update, despite me filling out a new owner information form. When I pointed this out to Linda via email, copying the management company and the president, she responded with a terse message saying I should have verified my contact information was correct and that she would not be held responsible for my oversights. Things escalated from there. 2 weeks later, I got a violation notice because my garage door was left open for more than 30 minutes during the day. I had been cleaning out the garage and moving some boxes around. Apparently, someone had reported me, and I had a pretty good guess who. The fine was $50. I paid it because the HOA had the power to put a lien on my house if I did not, but I was getting increasingly frustrated. I started documenting everything. I took photos of Linda's house and noticed her porch light was out, which according to Section 22.4, all exterior lighting must be functional for security purposes. I submitted a complaint. She replaced the bulb but started watching my house even more closely. Then came the garden hose incident. It was a Monday morning in early May, and the temperature was already hitting 95 degrees by 10 in the morning. I was working from home, on a video call with my team, when I heard a noise outside. I muted myself and looked out the window to see Linda in my driveway, disconnecting my garden hose from the spigot on the side of my house. I immediately ended the call and ran outside. "What are you doing?" She had already coiled up my hose and was carrying it toward the street. This hose is not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. Section 18.2 clearly states that all hoses and outdoor equipment must be stored out of sight when not in use. I used it this morning to water my trees. I was going to put it away. It has been visible for over 2 hours. I checked at 8 a.m. and it was already out. She kept walking with my hose. "You cannot just take my property." "I am not taking it. I am confiscating non-compliant items as per my authority as vice president. You can retrieve it from my garage once you have purchased an appropriate hose reel or storage solution and can prove compliance." I could not believe what I was hearing. "You are stealing my hose. I am enforcing HOA regulations." She reached the street where her white Mercedes SUV was parked. She opened the back and tossed my hose inside. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "I am documenting that you are taking my property without permission. Record all you want. I am within my rights." She got in her car and drove away. I stood there in shock for a moment, then went inside and immediately started making calls. First, I called the police non-emergency line. The dispatcher listened to my story and said it sounded like a civil matter and I should contact an attorney. I called the HOA management company and got voicemail. I left a detailed message explaining what had happened and saying that if my hose was not returned by end of business, I would be taking legal action. Then, I did what any frustrated person in 2025 would do. I posted about it on the neighborhood social media group. I laid out the facts clearly and calmly, explaining that the vice president had taken my personal property and was holding it hostage over an HOA violation. The responses started pouring in within minutes. Turns out, I was not Linda's first victim. A woman named Rachel 3 streets over said Linda had confiscated her doormat for being the wrong size. Another guy said she had taken his kid's basketball hoop because it was not stored in the garage. Someone else said she had threatened to remove their potted plants. There were dozens of stories. People were furious but felt powerless because Linda was tight with the president and basically ran the HOA like her personal fiefdom. One commenter, a retired lawyer named Frank who lived near the community entrance, sent me a private message. He told me that what Linda did was called conversion, which is basically civil theft, and I had grounds for a lawsuit. He also said the HOA was overstepping its authority, and that I should request a formal hearing with the board before they assessed any fines. I spent the rest of the day researching Arizona HOA law and my rights. I found out that while HOAs have broad powers, they cannot just take your personal property. They can fine you, they can put liens on your house, but they cannot physically remove items from your property without following proper legal channels, which typically involve getting a court order. At 5 p.m., I sent a formal email to Linda, copying the president, the management company, and every board member whose email I could find. I stated clearly that she had taken my property without authorization, that this constituted theft under Arizona law, and that I was demanding immediate return of my hose, or I would file a police report and a civil suit. Linda responded within 10 minutes. Her email was 3 paragraphs of HOA bylaw citations and ended with, "Your hose will be returned when you provide proof of compliant storage. Until then, it will remain in my possession to ensure continued community standards." That is when I called the police again, this time asking to file an actual report. An officer came out around 7 p.m. He was a younger guy, probably early 30s, named Officer Martinez. I showed him the email exchange, the video I had taken that morning, and explained the situation. "So she just took it from your property?" he asked, making notes, walked right up, disconnected it, and drove off with it. He shook his head. "HOA man, I have heard some stories, but this is something else. Technically, yes, this is theft. The value of the property matters, though." "How much was the hose worth?" "About $80. It is a really good hose." "Okay, so that is misdemeanor theft. Here is the thing, though. The DA probably would not prosecute this. They would call it a civil matter because you are in an HOA dispute." He closed his notepad. "What I can do is go have a conversation with her. Sometimes people change their tune when law enforcement gets involved." I gave him Linda's address, which was just across the street and 4 houses down. Officer Martinez drove over, and I watched from my window. He was there for about 15 minutes. When he came back, he did not look optimistic. "She is refusing to return it, says she is within her HOA authority." I explained that is not how property law works, but she was not having it. He handed me a case number. "Here is your report number." I would suggest small claims court at this point. You might also want to talk to a lawyer about the bigger HOA issues, because if she is doing this to you, she is probably doing it to others. After he left, I was fuming. It was not even about the hose anymore. It was the principle. This woman thought she could do whatever she wanted because she had a little bit of power in a homeowners association. I decided I was not going to let it go. The next morning, I filed a small claims court case against Linda Patterson for the value of my hose plus the maximum amount allowed for punitive damages. In Arizona, small claims caps at $3,500. I was suing for that full amount. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA board requesting an emergency hearing regarding Linda's conduct. Then I went to Home Depot and bought a new hose. A cheaper one this time, and a hose reel that I mounted on the side of my house in plain view. I took photos of the compliant installation and emailed them to Linda with a message that said, "Compliance achieved. Return my original hose immediately." She did not respond. That afternoon, I got a notice from the HOA. Linda had issued me a violation for the color of my new hose reel. It was black plastic, and apparently all exterior fixtures had to be in earth tones to match the desert aesthetic. The fine was $75. I legitimately laughed out loud when I read it. This woman was unbelievable. I responded with an email stating that I would not be paying the fine, and that I looked forward to seeing her in court. The next few days were relatively quiet. I focused on work, trying not to let the HOA drama consume my life. But I kept an eye on my security camera, which I had recently installed specifically because of Linda's tendency to prowl around my property. The camera covered my driveway, front yard, and the side of the house where the water spigot was located. On Friday evening, I went out with some coworkers who lived in Phoenix. We grabbed dinner and drinks in downtown Scottsdale, and I got home around 11 p.m. The house was dark and quiet. I was tired, so I went straight to bed. I woke up at 2:15 in the morning to the sound of sirens. Living near a main road, sirens were not unusual, but these sounded close. Really close. I got up and looked out my bedroom window, which faced the street. There was a fire truck in front of Linda's house, and an ambulance, and 2 police cars. The entire street was lit up with red and blue flashing lights. I threw on jeans and a shirt and went outside. Several neighbors were already out on their lawns, watching the scene. I walked over to a guy I had met briefly at the mailboxes named Tom. "What happened?" I asked. "Something with Linda's house. I heard someone say flooding." We watched as firefighters walked in and out of Linda's house, tracking water. Linda herself was standing on her front lawn in a bathrobe and slippers, and she was screaming, not at the firefighters, but at me. The moment she saw me, she pointed and started yelling, "This is your fault. You did this. I am calling my lawyer. You are going to pay for this." A police officer stepped between us as she started storming toward me. "Madam, you need to stay calm. He sabotaged my house. He flooded my basement." She was hysterical. I had no idea what she was talking about. "I just woke up. I've been home asleep since 11. The officer, a woman named Officer Torres according to her name tag, looked at me. "Do you know what she is talking about?" "I have no idea. I literally just came outside." One of the firefighters, a captain based on his helmet, came over. "We are going to need to ask you both some questions. Madam, can you explain what happened?" Linda was shaking with rage, but she tried to compose herself. "I woke up to water pouring through my floor. My entire basement is flooded. Thousands of gallons of water. When I went outside to check, I found this." She held up something green and dripping. "My garden hose. This was connected to my outdoor spigot and running at full blast, going through my basement window. He did this as revenge because I confiscated his hose for HOA violations." I stared at her. "That is my hose, the one you stole from me on Monday." "I did not steal it. I confiscated it per HOA regulations. And I am supposed to have come over in the middle of the night, connected it to your house and flooded your basement." I looked at Officer Torres. "That is insane. I have been home all evening. Plus, she has had my hose all week. How would I even get it?" The firefighter captain examined the hose. This was definitely attached to the exterior spigot and left running. The other end was placed through a basement window well. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The basement has about 8 inches of standing water. Officer Torres turned to me. "Can you account for your whereabouts this evening?" "I was out until 11 with coworkers. I can give you their names and the restaurants we went to. I got home, went straight to bed. My security camera will show that I did not leave my house after I got home." Security camera. Linda's face went pale. "Yeah, I installed one last week. It covers my driveway and the street-facing side of my property." I looked at Officer Torres. "The footage is saved to the cloud. I can pull it up right now if you want." We went to my house, and I logged into my security camera app on my laptop. Officer Torres and the fire captain watched as I pulled up the evening's footage. It clearly showed me pulling into my driveway at 11:07 p.m., going into my house, and the lights going off around 11:30. No movement after that. My car stayed in the driveway all night. "Can we see earlier in the evening?" Officer Torres asked. "Before you got home," I scrolled back. At 6:45 p.m. the camera showed me leaving for dinner. Then nothing until around 9:30 p.m., when something interesting appeared. Linda's white Mercedes SUV pulled up in front of my house. Linda got out, went to my side gate and disappeared for about 3 minutes. When she came back, she was not carrying anything visible. She got in her car and left. "What was she doing?" the captain asked. I switched to the camera view that covered the side yard. It showed Linda trying my water spigot, turning it on and off, checking it. Then she disconnected my compliant hose from the reel and took it. She put it in her car and drove away. She took my new hose, I said, stunned. Why would she take my new hose when she already had my old one? Officer Torres was making notes. What time did you say you got home? 11:07. She looked at Linda, who had followed us over and was standing in my doorway. Madam, can you explain why you were at his property at 9:30 taking another hose? Linda's mouth opened and closed. I was doing an evening compliance check. I noticed he had installed equipment without approval. And you took his hose? I was confiscating non-compliant equipment. The captain shook his head. So you had 2 of his hoses at your residence? Yes, but I did not use them to flood my own basement. That is ridiculous. He must have come over after I fell asleep. Check your security camera footage, I said. If you have cameras, they would show who did this. Linda's face went even paler. I do not have cameras. Convenient, Officer Torres said. Okay, here is what I think happened based on the evidence. Madam, you took this gentleman's hoses as part of an HOA dispute. At some point this evening, someone connected one of those hoses to your outdoor spigot and set it to flood your basement. The question is who? It was him, Linda pointed at me, except his security footage shows he was not there. He was out until after 11, and by then, based on the amount of water in your basement, the flooding had been going on for at least 2 hours, according to the fire captain's estimate. The captain nodded. Water damage is consistent with the hose running from approximately 9:30 or 10 p.m. until around 1:30 am when she discovered it. So it could not have been me, I said. I was not even home until 11, and I clearly did not leave after that. Officer Torres looked at Linda. Madam, is there anyone else who had access to your property this evening? Anyone who might have had access to these hoses? Linda was silent for a long moment. Then her face crumpled. I do not understand. The hoses were in my garage. Who would do this? A terrible thought occurred to me. Officer, is it possible that she did this herself? Like accidentally? What are you talking about? Linda snapped. You took my second hose at 9:30. You had both hoses at your place. You said they were in your garage. Is your garage attached to your house? Yes. What does that have to do with anything? Do you have a door from your garage to your basement? Her face went white as a sheet. Officer Torres caught on. Madam, is it possible you were moving the hoses around in your garage and accidentally turned on a spigot or connected one and left it running? I did not do this to myself. That is insane. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Officer, if I could offer a theory. She came to my house at 9:30 and took my second hose out of spite. She went home and put both hoses in her garage. Maybe she was mad. Maybe she was distracted, but she connected one of them to her utility sink or whatever water source she has in the garage, and somehow it got turned on. The hose could have been lying near the basement door or a vent, and the water started flowing down there. The fire captain nodded slowly. That would actually explain a lot. The hose was found connected to the exterior spigot, but it could have been moved there when she discovered the flood in a panic. I did not do that, Linda shouted. Why would I move it outside? Because you were panicking and not thinking clearly, Officer Torres suggested. And maybe you thought you could blame someone else. Linda's lawyer would later argue that this was all speculation. But in the moment, standing on my lawn at 2:30 in the morning, the truth was becoming clear to everyone. Linda had been so obsessed with confiscating my hoses and controlling every aspect of the neighborhood that she had essentially stolen my property, and in her carelessness or spite, had caused her own disaster. I want to file charges, I said. She has admitted to taking my property not once but twice. That is theft. And if she tried to frame me for the flooding, that is filing a false police report. Officer Torres looked at Linda. "Madam, I am going to need you to come down to the station and give a formal statement. Based on what I have seen here tonight, there are some serious questions about your actions. This is outrageous. I am a vice president of this HOA. I was enforcing community standards. You were stealing people's property," I said. "There is a difference." The rest of that night was a blur. Officer Torres took statements from both of us. I provided my security camera footage and the case number from my previous police report. Several neighbors came forward and said they had also had property confiscated by Linda over the years and had been too afraid to speak up because of retaliation. Linda was not arrested that night, but she was given a citation for misdemeanor theft. The prosecutor would decide whether to file formal charges. Her basement had approximately $8,000 in damage according to the initial estimate from her homeowner's insurance, which she would have to pay the deductible on. And because the damage was caused by her own negligence, there was a question about whether insurance would even cover it. I finally got back to sleep around 5 in the morning. When I woke up at 10, my phone was blowing up. The neighborhood social media group had exploded. Someone had been recording the whole thing on their phone from across the street and had posted clips online. By noon, the story had been picked up by a local news station. By evening, it had gone viral on social media. The headlines were perfect. HOA Karen floods own basement with stolen hose. HOA vice president accused of theft, self-sabotage. One news station even did a whole segment on HOA overreach and used Linda as the prime example. I got calls from 3 different lawyers offering to represent me pro bono in my case against Linda and the HOA. I chose Frank, the retired lawyer from the neighborhood who had first messaged me. He was delighted to take the case. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the following Tuesday. I attended, and so did about 70 other residents. The room was packed. Robert Chen, the president, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Linda was not there. She had resigned her position the day after the flooding incident. Robert cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We are here tonight to discuss recent events and concerns that have been raised about HOA enforcement practices. I want to start by saying that the board takes these concerns seriously." "Not seriously enough," someone shouted from the back. "Linda has been terrorizing this neighborhood for 3 years. The meeting devolved into chaos. Person after person stood up and shared stories of Linda's abuse of power. Stolen property, excessive fines, harassment, threats. It painted a picture of someone who had completely lost sight of what an HOA was supposed to do, which is maintain property values and community standards, not rule over people like a tyrant." One woman stood up crying and said Linda had threatened to fine her $500 a day because her son's wheelchair ramp did not match the approved aesthetic guidelines. Another man said Linda had tried to force him to remove solar panels that were saving him thousands on electricity because they were visible from the street. The stories went on and on. Robert finally held up his hands. Okay, I hear you. The board is going to conduct a full review of our enforcement practices and the incidents that have been reported. We are also going to be revising our bylaws to add more oversight and prevent this kind of abuse from happening again." "What about restitution?" Frank stood up. "Many people in this room have had property stolen, have paid excessive fines, or have incurred costs because of unlawful HOA actions. What is the board going to do about that?" Robert looked at the HOA attorney, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s who had been sitting quietly in the corner. She stood up. "The HOA's insurance may cover some claims if we can establish that the actions were taken by individuals acting outside their authority." "Linda was vice president," someone yelled. She had authority. She had authority to enforce rules, not to steal property, the attorney clarified. If she was taking actions that violated Arizona law, those were personal actions, not HOA-sanctioned actions, and she can be held personally liable. That was music to my ears. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Frank to build a comprehensive case. We were not just going after the small claims amount for my hoses. We were going after damages for harassment, emotional distress, and violation of my property rights. We also filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs in the state. The legal process moved slower than I wanted, but things were happening. Linda was formally charged with misdemeanor theft for taking my property. She pleaded not guilty and hired an expensive lawyer who argued that she had been acting in her official capacity as an HOA officer and believed she had the authority to confiscate non-compliant items. The prosecutor, a sharp woman in her 30s named Jessica Romero, was not buying it. Your Honor, the defendant has admitted to taking the plaintiff's property on 2 separate occasions. She has also admitted to keeping that property at her residence, despite his requests for its return. The fact that she claims HOA authority does not negate the fact that she took something that did not belong to her without legal justification. Arizona HOAs do not have the authority to seize personal property. They can fine, they can place liens, but they cannot take physical items. What the defendant did was theft, plain and simple. Linda's lawyer, a slick guy named Martin Goldberg, argued that this was a civil matter blown out of proportion. Your Honor, this is clearly an HOA dispute that should be handled through civil channels, not criminal court. My client was doing her job as vice president, attempting to maintain community standards. Judge Patricia Morrison, who was handling the case, looked over her reading glasses at Goldberg. Counselor, if your client's job involved taking people's property without their consent, then her job description was illegal. I am not dismissing these charges. The trial was set for August. In the meantime, my civil case was moving forward. Frank had assembled a class of about 15 homeowners who had been victimized by Linda over the years. We were suing her personally and the HOA for enabling her behavior. The total damages we were seeking were close to $200,000. The HOA board, now under new leadership after Robert Chen resigned in disgrace for allowing Linda's behavior to continue unchecked, was surprisingly cooperative. The new president, a retired teacher named Margaret Flynn, reached out to me personally to apologize and to let me know that the board was committed to reform. We had no idea the extent of what Linda was doing, she told me over coffee at a local cafe. Robert basically let her run wild because he did not want to deal with enforcement himself. He is retired military, likes things orderly, and Linda convinced him she was maintaining order. He did not ask questions. How did she get away with it for so long? I asked. Margaret sighed. Fear, mostly. She targeted people who were new, who did not know their rights, or who were afraid of losing their homes to liens. A lot of the retirees in the community are on fixed incomes. The threat of $100 a day in fines is terrifying to someone living on Social Security. That is predatory. That is exactly what it was. She took a sip of her coffee. The board wants to make this right. We are proposing a settlement fund for everyone who was affected. We are also completely rewriting the enforcement procedures and adding a homeowner bill of rights to the bylaws. No more surprise inspections. No more confiscation of property. Everything has to go through proper channels with proper notice and the ability to appeal. What about Linda? She is on her own. The board has made it clear that she acted outside her authority, and we are not covering her legal expenses. Her homeowner's insurance is refusing to pay for her basement because they determined it was negligence. Last I heard, she is trying to sell her house and move. I felt a twinge of something that might have been sympathy. But then I remembered her standing in my driveway, taking my hose, and the feeling passed. She had made her choices. The criminal trial in August was surprisingly quick. The prosecutor presented the security footage, the police reports, and testimony from me and several other homeowners. Linda's lawyer tried to argue that she had acted in good faith, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty of misdemeanor theft. The judge sentenced her to 6 months of probation, community service, and ordered her to pay restitution to all the victims whose property she had taken. For me, that meant the cost of both hoses plus interest. For others, it was doormats, basketball hoops, holiday decorations, and various other items. The total came to just over $4,000, but the criminal case was just the appetizer. The civil case went to mediation in September, and that is where Linda really felt the pain. Faced with the prospect of a lengthy trial and almost certain massive judgment against her, she agreed to a settlement. She paid me $12,000 for damages, harassment, and legal fees. The other homeowners in the class action received varying amounts based on what they had been through. The HOA's insurance covered most of it, but Linda had to contribute $50,000 of her own money. She sold her house in October and moved out of state. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she went to Nevada to live with her sister. Good riddance. The HOA under new management was like night and day. Margaret and the new board actually listened to homeowners. They reduced the ridiculous rules about house numbers and hose colors. They established clear procedures for inspections with mandatory notice. They set up an ombudsman system where homeowners could file complaints anonymously if they felt they were being treated unfairly. Property values in Saguaro Heights actually went up after all the news coverage. Turned out people liked living in an HOA that was not run by a tyrant. The community Facebook group went from being a place where people complained and fought to being actually useful for organizing events and sharing information. I kept my security cameras. Fool me once and all that. But I never had another problem with HOA enforcement. My garden hoses, yes plural, I bought 3 backups, stayed neatly on their approved hose reels. My garbage cans lived behind their storage screen. My house numbers were the correct bronze font, but I also served on the HOA board for a year, just to make sure the reform stuck. I worked with Frank and Margaret to create a comprehensive homeowner handbook that actually explained your rights, not just your obligations. We distributed it to every home in the community and made it required reading for any board member. I ran into Linda one more time, completely by accident. It was the following March, almost a year after the hose incident. I was in Las Vegas for a work conference, and I stopped into a restaurant for dinner. She was there with a group of women, and we made eye contact across the room. She looked older, tired. For a moment, I thought she might come over and say something, but she just looked away and went back to her conversation. I did not approach her. There was nothing to say. She had been the architect of her own destruction. If she had just returned my hose when I asked, none of it would have happened. But she had been so convinced of her own authority, so drunk on the small amount of power the HOA gave her, that she could not see how badly she was overstepping. The whole experience taught me a lot about power dynamics and community living. HOAs are not inherently bad. They serve a purpose in maintaining property values and shared spaces. But they attract a certain kind of person sometimes, people who crave authority and control, And if there is not proper oversight, those people can make life miserable for everyone around them. It also taught me to document everything. My security cameras saved me from what could have been a serious false accusation. My email records provided a clear timeline of Linda's escalating harassment. My receipts proved the value of my stolen property. In any dispute, especially one involving someone with perceived authority, documentation is your best defense. My friends still laugh about the story. "You are the guy whose HOA Karen flooded her own basement with a stolen hose," became my claim to fame. Local news stations called me back for follow-up stories about HOA reform. I even got invited to speak at a community organization meeting about homeowner rights. But mostly, life returned to normal. I went to work. I maintained my house. I enjoyed my backyard with its desert willows and mountain views. I made friends with my actual neighbors, the people who lived around me, not the ones who wanted to control every aspect of the neighborhood. Tom, the neighbor who had been outside the night of the flooding, became a good friend. He had his own Linda stories, including one about her trying to fine him because his dog was the wrong breed. Apparently, there was some obscure bylaw about aggressive breeds, and she had decided his golden retriever was a golden retriever lab mix, and therefore 50% lab, and labs were on the restricted list. It had not gone anywhere because it was completely insane, but the fact that she had tried showed how far gone she was. We would barbecue in my backyard sometimes, him and his wife Jennifer and a few other neighbors, and someone would inevitably bring up the hose incident. The story got more elaborate with each telling, but the core facts remained bizarre enough that they did not need embellishment. The house across the street where Linda had lived sold to a young couple with 2 kids. They were nice, normal people who just wanted to live their lives. When they introduced themselves and asked about the neighborhood, I gave them the short version of the story and told them the HOA was under new management, and much better now. They laughed and said they had actually read about it online before buying, and that the reforms were part of why they felt comfortable moving to Saguaro Heights. So in a weird way, Linda's tyranny and spectacular downfall had actually made the neighborhood better. Sometimes you need a cautionary tale to remind people why rules exist and why oversight matters. Linda was that cautionary tale. I still have the original green garden hose, the expensive one that started everything. I do not use it anymore because I legitimately bought better ones, but I kept it as a souvenir. It sits coiled on a shelf in my garage, a reminder of the time I went to war with an HOA Karen over something that cost $80 and won. My lawyer, Frank, said it was one of the most satisfying cases of his career, even though he had handled major corporate litigation before retiring. There is something particularly gratifying about seeing an everyday bully get what they deserve, he told me at the celebration dinner after the settlement came through. Linda thought she was untouchable because she had a title and some authority. She learned the hard way that the law applies to everyone. The money from the settlement went partly to paying Frank's fees, even though he had offered to work pro bono. I insisted on paying him what was fair. The rest I donated to a local legal aid organization that helps homeowners fight HOA abuse. If my experience could help other people stand up to neighborhood tyrants, then something good would come of the whole mess. Looking back now, 2 years later, the whole thing feels almost surreal. Did I really have an HOA vice president steal my garden hose? Did she really flood her own basement with it in what was either an act of incredible stupidity or an attempted frame job? Did I really end up on the local news and get interviewed about HOA reform? Yes. Yes to all of it. And would I do anything differently? Maybe. I could have been more proactive about reading the HOA bylaws before buying. I could have asked more questions about the board and how enforcement worked. But honestly, even knowing what I know now, I do not think I would have predicted Linda. Some people are just beyond prediction. The important thing is that when I was faced with injustice, I did not just roll over and accept it. I documented, I researched, I got help, and I fought back through proper legal channels. I did not take vigilante justice. I did not slash her tires or toilet paper her house. I used the system, and the system worked. That is the real lesson here. You do not have to accept abuse from anyone, not even someone with official-sounding authority in your homeowners association. You have rights. Property rights, due process rights, the right to not have your stuff stolen. And if someone violates those rights, there are ways to fight back. So that is the story of how an HOA Karen stole my garden hose, left it running, and flooded her own basement. It is a story about petty tyranny, poetic justice, and the importance of security cameras. It is a story about how sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and the people who try to make others miserable end up hoisting themselves by their own petard, or in this case, drowning themselves with their own stolen hose. I water my desert willows now with good quality hoses stored on approved hose reels, and I have never been happier. The HOA leaves me alone, my neighbors are friendly, and Linda is someone else's problem now, hopefully having learned her lesson about respecting other people's property and not abusing whatever small amount of power she is given. And if she has not learned that lesson, well, that is not my problem anymore. Life in Saguaro Heights goes on. The Arizona sun still beats down mercilessly in the summer. The mountain views are still stunning at sunset. The community pool is well maintained and the landscaping at the entrance looks nice. The HOA functions the way it should, managing shared resources and maintaining standards without making anyone's life miserable. I expanded my garden last spring, following all the proper procedures and getting approval from the new Architectural Review Committee, which now includes 3 homeowners and makes decisions by consensus instead of by fiat. I planted some native desert plants, installed a drip irrigation system, and created a little oasis in my backyard. It is peaceful there in the evenings, sitting out with a cold drink, watching the sky turn orange and purple as the sun goes down behind the mountains. Sometimes I think about Linda sitting in her flooded basement, realizing what had happened, and wondering how I am going to explain this. I think about the moment she decided to connect my hose to her spigot in some misguided attempt to frame me, not realizing that she was about to ruin her own house. Or if it really was an accident, the moment of panic when she discovered the water and decided to try to blame me anyway. Either way, it was a spectacular own goal, as they say in soccer. She spent years building up this reputation as the HOA enforcer, collecting power and authority and using it to control people. And it all came crashing down because she could not leave one guy's garden hose alone. There is probably a Greek tragedy in there somewhere. Pride comes before a fall and all that. But I am not a philosophy major. I am just a guy who wanted to water his trees in peace and ended up as a local folk hero for standing up to an HOA bully. The funny thing is, I am not even particularly confrontational by nature. I am a software engineer. I like solving problems with code, not conflict. But sometimes conflict finds you, and when it does, you have to decide whether you are going to be a doormat or you are going to stand up for yourself. I chose to stand up, and I am glad I did. Not just for me, but for all the other people in the neighborhood who had been pushed around and did not know they could fight back. My case opened the floodgates, no pun intended, for others to come forward with their stories. The class action lawsuit might not have made anyone rich, but it sent a message. You cannot treat people like this and get away with it. The new HOA board sent me a thank you card on the 1-year anniversary of the reform's passing. It was signed by Margaret and the other board members and said, "Thank you for caring enough about our community to demand better. Your courage inspired real change." I kept it on my fridge for a while, then filed it away with all the other documents from that whole saga. I have a folder in my filing cabinet labeled the HOA incident that is about 3 inches thick. Police reports, court documents, settlement agreements, news articles, printouts of social media posts. It is a comprehensive record of one of the weirdest episodes of my life. Sometimes I flip through it and marvel at how absurd the whole thing was, but it happened. It was real, and it had real consequences for real people. Linda lost her position, her reputation, and tens of thousands of dollars. The HOA lost 2 board members and had to completely restructure its governance. I gained some local notoriety and a story I will be telling for the rest of my life. And somewhere in Nevada, I hope Linda has learned to leave other people's property alone, though somehow I doubt it. People like that rarely change. They just find new victims and new ways to exercise whatever small amount of control they can grab. But that is not my concern anymore. I did my part. I fought my battle and won. Now I am just a homeowner in Scottsdale, Arizona, living my life, enjoying my house, and watering my plants with hoses that no one is going to steal. Well, probably. I mean, I still have those security cameras running 24/7, just in case. Because if there is one thing I learned from this whole experience, it is that you can never be too careful when it comes to HOAs and garden hoses. You just never know when someone is going to decide that enforcing aesthetic standards is more important than respecting basic property rights. But lightning does not strike twice, right? I am probably safe. The new board is great. The neighbors are wonderful. Everything is fine. And if another HOA Karen ever shows up and tries to take my stuff, well, I've got a lawyer on speed dial, cameras covering every angle, and a story about what happened to the last person who tried it. I think I will be okay. The desert sunset is beautiful tonight. The temperature has finally dropped below 90 degrees. My irrigation system is watering my plants on its automatic timer. My hoses are securely stored on their reels. My HOA dues are paid, and I am in full compliance with all community standards. Life is good in Saguaro Heights. Life is peaceful. Life is exactly what I hoped it would be when I moved here 2 years ago, before I knew that homeowners associations could be battlegrounds and garden hoses could become the centerpiece of a legal saga. I learned a lot about contracts and property law and HOA governance, about standing up for yourself and not backing down when you are in the right, about the importance of documentation and evidence, about how small-time tyrants operate and how to fight them. But mostly, I learned that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice, and the people who try hardest to make others miserable end up getting exactly what they deserve. Linda stole my hose to punish me for daring to question her authority. That hose ended up destroying her basement, her reputation, and her position. Karma is real, and sometimes it comes in the form of 8,000 gallons of water flooding your basement at 2 in the morning. I raise my glass to the desert sky, toasting the memory of that ridiculous night, the fire trucks and ambulances, Linda in her bathrobe screaming accusations, and me standing there with security footage that proved my innocence and her guilt. It was absurd. It was infuriating. It was stressful. But in the end, Justice was served, reforms were made, and one HOA Karen learned that you cannot steal people's garden hoses and expect to get away with it. And that, as they say, is that. The end. No, wait, not quite. Because I should mention what happened to Robert Chen, the former HOA president. He actually apologized to me personally about 6 months after everything went down. We ran into each other at the grocery store and he approached me looking uncomfortable. "Derek, I owe you an apology," he said. I should have kept a closer eye on Linda. I knew she was aggressive with enforcement, but I did not realize she was actually breaking the law. I failed in my responsibility as president. I appreciated that. It takes courage to admit you were wrong. "Thanks, Robert. I accept your apology." I quit the board because I knew I had let things get out of hand. I am retired military, and I thought having strong enforcement was good for the community. I did not realize I was enabling a bully. He shook his head. "It is a mistake I will not make again." We talked for a few more minutes, and I learned that he had actually become an advocate for HOA reform at the state level. He was working with a coalition of homeowners and legislators to push for stronger oversight and clearer limitations on HOA powers. His experience with Linda had opened his eyes to how easily these organizations could be abused, so something good came out of it for him too. He took his mistake and turned it into motivation to fix a broken system. I respected that. As for me, my term on the HOA board ended after a year, and I did not run for re-election. I had done what I set out to do, which was ensure the reform stuck and that we had proper procedures in place. Now it was time for someone else to step up and keep the momentum going. I still attend HOA meetings occasionally, just to stay informed, but I am not as involved as I was. Life has moved on. Work keeps me busy. I have got hobbies and friends and a social life beyond my neighborhood drama, but people still recognize me sometimes. "Hey, are not you the garden hose guy?" I will be at a restaurant or a store or some community event, and someone will make the connection. It usually leads to them sharing their own HOA horror story, because apparently everyone has one. HOAs are a uniquely American invention. This idea that you can buy a house, but still have someone tell you what color you can paint it, or what kind of mailbox you can have, or whether your hose can be visible from the street. In theory, they protect property values. In practice, they often become little fiefdoms run by people who peaked in high school and crave the feeling of authority. Linda was the ultimate example of that type, and her downfall was the ultimate example of what happens when that authority goes unchecked. She pushed and pushed and pushed until she finally pushed too far and the whole thing collapsed around her. I do not hate her, not anymore. I did for a while, in the thick of the legal battles and the stress of dealing with her harassment. But now, with distance and perspective, I mostly just feel sorry for her. What kind of life must you have to get that much satisfaction from controlling whether your neighbor's hoses are visible? What kind of emptiness are you trying to fill? Those are questions for a therapist, not for me. My role in her story ended when the settlement check cleared and she moved away. What she does with her life now is her business. My business is living well, being a good neighbor, contributing to my community in positive ways, and making sure my garden hoses are stored properly. Because some lessons, you only need to learn once, so really, truly, finally. That is the story of the HOA Karen who stole my garden hose, left it running, and flooded her own basement. It is a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Justice was served, lessons were learned, reforms were implemented, and everyone except Linda lived happily ever after. And my desert willows, they are thriving. Turns out when you can water them without fear of your equipment being confiscated by an overzealous HOA officer, they grow beautifully. They provide nice shade in the summer, attract hummingbirds, and make my backyard feel like the peaceful desert oasis I always wanted. That was worth fighting for. My home, my property, my peace of mind. Linda tried to take all of that away over petty rule enforcement and a power trip. She failed. I won, and every time I water my trees I remember that victory. It is a small thing, using a hose without drama, but sometimes the small things matter most. That is it. That is the whole story. No more epilogues or postscripts or additional updates. Just a guy, his house, his hoses, and the HOA Karen who learned the hard way that you cannot steal people's property and get away with it, no matter what kind of authority you think you have. The end. For real this time.